Hello and welcome. My name is Grace Greger and I will be your proctor for today's class. In today's class, we will be discussing cognitive load, the multimedia theory of cognitive load. We will also be discussing redundancy, the signaling principle, spatial contiguity, and refutation text. The cognitive load theory is primarily concerned with how we acquire biologically secondary knowledge. Just to review, biologically secondary knowledge is information that we have not acquired as human beings as we have grown and evolved. The best way to acquire biologically secondary knowledge, though, is through one of two ways. Either rote learning, so we memorize things such as multiplication tables, ABCs, and just basic facts. The other way we can learn things is through understanding. Understanding takes the things we learned in rote learning and actually applies it to a new situation we've never had before. There are 5 basic principles of the cognitive load theory. They are the information store principle, the borrowing and reorganizing principle, the randomness as genius principle, the narrow limits of change principle, and the environmental organizing and linking principle. The information store principle, this takes into account the fact that we need a large form of information, and this information needs to be learned slowly and over time. So as we integrate this knowledge or this information, this will become our long-term memory. It's a very, very large capacity and can hold multiple things. However, in order to actually learn anything new, we must alter this long-term memory. The second principle is the borrowing and reorganizing principle. This principle basically says that we can learn from other people. So we watch what they do, we imitate what they do, and then we integrate that knowledge we're learning from others and combine it with our pre-existing knowledge that we have in our own long-term memory. So that whole conglomerate of incorporating what they know into what we already know alters our long-term memory. The randomness as genesis principle just addresses the fact that learning can be a guessing game sometimes. So if we don't have what we need in our repertoire of knowledge, basically we as humans, we just start trying things. We'll keep trying and trying and trying, guessing what in the world might work until finally we find something that does work. The narrow limits of change principle just addresses the fact that our working memory does not have that large of a capacity. So we're only able to concentrate on a couple of things at a time. Everything else gets lost. So for example, like your grocery list. Maybe you think of 1 or 3 items on your list, but you forget the rest of everything that's on it. Take this picture, for example, also. Take 30 seconds to try to remember as many of these toys as you can. Pause the video, of course, as you study the picture. Then, cover up the picture so you cannot see the toys, and try to write down as many of the toys as you remember. You'll probably find you're going to have about half or less. So that is this theory. The 5th and final principle is the environmental organizing and linking principle. In this principle, you're linking the information from a long-term memory to the actual environment around you. So with this principle, you would be looking at the environment around you, using cues and things that you have learned to establish what the appropriate response would be. So if you walk into a certain room, well, depending who's sitting on there, like either a best friend or your boss, you're going to determine how you should react. The cognitive load architecture is made up of 3 different concepts. 1, that working memory is limited. 2, that working memory and long-term memory have different limitations placed on them. And 3, that any knowledge learned is organized in structures called schemas. The 3 types of cognitive load are intrinsic, extraneous, and germane, and they are primarily concerned with how we acquire biologically secondary information, how we store it, and how we use it. The intrinsic cognitive load has to deal with primarily the complexity of the learning material, all of the interacting elements associated with that learning material, and it is in direct correlation to what the learner already knows. Extraneous cognitive load is made up of how the learning material is actually presented to the learner. Germane cognitive load deals with the actual learning process. So it uses working memory processes to actually deal with the intrinsic cognitive load. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning refers to our ability as humans to construct knowledge from words and pictures. The words can be spoken or read, and the pictures can be static and dynamic. Research has shown that we as humans can learn much more efficiently and more deeply from a combination of words and pictures than from just words alone. In addition, multimedia messages that are designed according to how our brains work are actually much more better. They enable us to learn more deeply than media messages that are not designed according to how our brains work. The limited capacity assumption states that humans are limited in the amount of information that a specific channel can process at any given time. The active processing assumption explains how we as humans take relevant information from a presentation, organize it, and then integrate it into our long-term memory by connecting it to previously learned information. According to Mayer, there are specific things that the learner must do in a multimedia learning environment or presentation in order to make meaning out of the presentation. So they have to select the relevant words and relevant pictures, and then they have to organize those relevant words and pictures, and then they have to integrate the two of them together. So integrate all of the relevant words and relative pictures, and then take that integration and relate it back to what the learner already has in their long-term memory. There are also 3 demands on the learner's processing system during learning. The first demand is extraneous processing. This demand refers to the cognitive processing that has absolutely nothing to do with the learning goal. Essential processing is the second demand, and it is made up of the complexity of the learning material itself. The third demand, generative processing, has to do with how well the student reorganizes all of the incoming learning information or learning material, and how well they integrate it into their long-term memory. According to Richard Mayer, the redundancy principle states that we can learn so much more through just graphics and narration than we can from graphics, narration, and on-screen information combined. It is very important that we as educators do not overload our students' channels, both auditory and visual. When we're throwing a lot of information at them, it can be very overwhelming with all the online pictures, and then we are talking on top of that, and they are reading the same text that we are speaking all at the same time. Redundancy goes hand in hand with the information store principle and the extraneous processing and extraneous load principles. So basically, if we're throwing all this information at our students, the information that is not important The information that the professor just keeps repeating and going on and on and on and on about needs to be eliminated. Take it out. Keep only what is absolutely necessary for the student to learn what you are trying to teach them. In the real world, everyday life, redundancy can happen anywhere and at any time. For example, take the picture of this book that I used to read my daughter. I used to read this to my daughter all the time, but I never really realized that I was being redundant. By me reading the words of the book out loud to her, and then having the words on each page of the book, and my daughter also internally reading, because she could read at that time, I was being redundant with her, and I was overloading her working memory. The signaling principle brings attention to the fact that we learn more deeply when our attention is brought to the most important information of a multimedia message. Therefore, in order to signal to the students that this is the most important information you need to know, we use cues. Cues reduce the extraneous load, and therefore the student's working load is not as overwhelmed, and deeper, meaningful learning can take place. In order to help alleviate the extraneous processing and extraneous load on our students' working memory, we can use cueing such as highlighting, circling, pointing, and just even using different tones of voice or intonation. For example, saying something louder, putting more emphasis on a word, and at times speaking quieter. These cues grabs our students' attention to, hey, this is something different and this is something important that I need to pay attention to. According to Mayer, the spatial contiguity principle states that people learn better if words and pictures are placed closer together rather than far apart. So essentially, if students have to keep flipping back and forth between the words and the actual picture, it is going to overload their working memory. This next picture we are going to look at is an excellent example of how we as educators can reduce the spatial contiguity in our classrooms. This picture shows a beautiful picture of a flower and its working parts. By including the text with each part, the learner is able to absorb the information so much easier and thus reducing their working memory. If the picture and the words had been spread apart, the learner would have been forced to flip back and forth, and therefore the learning would have taken extra time and the learner may have actually gotten confused. According to Tippett, refutation text is a structured text that is used to challenge a student's misconceptions. It has two parts. Basically, the student's misconception and a refutation to that misconception that is formed by science. So basically, it is forcing the student to think about their misconception in a new way and hopefully challenging their ideas enough in order for them to integrate new learning and then form new ideas. As a health teacher, I am constantly refuting my students' misconceptions. When they come to me, they really don't have very much information in the health field. So it is my job to take what they have learned either from the opinions of others or kind of what they've heard, as word off the street, and help the students to learn what the real knowledge is for particular topics. For example, every year we study the topic of mental and emotional health. Well, mental and emotional health is kind of a stigma in our society, so it's not looked upon in a very good light. For example, in this picture here, you can see that, the students in the background are making fun of the student in the front of the picture. That happens a lot. It happens a lot, period. But when you add something like depression, bipolar, ADD, anxiety, any of those mental illnesses, you mix that into the picture and the student will get picked on even more. It's because we don't talk about the brain things that go on. We don't talk about, like with depression, how the chemicals are just not right in the brain, so it's causing all these extra emotions and things like that. We don't talk about why the brain's not functioning the way it is. So because my students don't understand what's going on with the human brain and everything that should be going right, and that it's not that person's fault that they have a mental illness, their behavior is not really the best. So it is my job to give my students the information that they need in order to understand mental and emotional illness as it really is, instead of what they've always thought it was. Thank you for attending today's lesson on cognitive load, cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and things such as refutation texts, redundancy, spatial contiguity, and signaling. Once again, my name is Grace Greger, and I will see you next time.